Greetings and welcome back to Lutheran Witness Podcast. I'm your host, Roy Askins, Executive Editor of the Lutheran Witness. Today we have something special, a little out of the ordinary, that I think will be great for you, our listeners, and for the people of the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod. Before we dive in, however, I want to give a quick shout out to our podcast partners, kfuo.org. If you're in the St. Louis area, you can pick them up on AM 850 or 92.7 FM, 104.5 FM, or 105.3 FM. Check them out. Christ for you, anytime, anywhere, kfuo.org. Thank you again, KFUO, for being our podcast partners. Today in this podcast, we're going to be discussing Resolution 911 that will be coming before the convention this summer. And the title here is to amend bylaw section 1.5, etc., to unify in the bylaws and revise corporate formation requirements for instrumental entities of corporate synod and agencies of synod. Now, I hope you didn't fall asleep in the reading of that title. This is, it might seem boring. I guarantee this is not a boring thing to discuss. We have a lot here that will actually affect the life of our church together and how we live together as the body of Christ. So, the fact of the matter is, this resolution has been criticized in a couple of different ways. One of them being that this is an attempt by, say, the Board of Directors to overreach its authority and do more than it should be doing. On the other hand, it's been criticized as perhaps putting the church into the work of business, right? Focusing more on business matters than the work of the church. So, of course, those who are proponents of the resolution have differing opinions. And today, to discuss this, we have three wonderful proponents of the resolution to talk about and explain what we're trying to accomplish here in this resolution. So I'll start off with Reverend Dr. Mike Gibson, District President of the LCMS Pacific Southwest District. Mike, how are you doing today?
I'm doing well, Roy. Thanks for having me on. I'm looking forward to this conversation and information that we could give to the Synod.
Thank you very much, Mike. I appreciate you getting up a little early and joining us. I know the time's a little earlier there in California than over here in St. Louis. We also have Andrew Grahams, the current Vice Chairman of the LCMS Board of Directors, and he's from Franklin, Tennessee. Andrew, good to see you and have you with us also.
Good to see you as well, Roy. Thank you for having me on.
And then finally, we have certainly last but certainly not least, that's how we want to say that correctly, the Reverend Dr. John Sias, Secretary of Synod, joining us today from St. Louis. John, glad to have you here also.
Pleasure's mine. Thanks for doing this.
Glad to do it. We don't have a ton of time, so we're just going to dive right on in. And I think I want to start with really the overview question and getting a sense of what is this resolution all about and what is it trying to accomplish. So, John, I want to start with you. Could you paint in broad strokes what is this resolution about? What are the issues it's trying to resolve?
Yeah, sure. I can do that briefly. I want to frame that in terms of some challenges and opportunities. I sit in kind of a unique seat in the Synod, serving on the Commission for Constitutional Matters, which is charged to examine the governing documents of all the agencies of the Synod and all the corporate pieces that we've made for our life together to ensure that they're consistent with the Constitution, bylaws, and resolutions of the Synod. So I sit on that commission on the one hand. I also sit on the Board of Directors of Synod, which is charged to be the legal representative of the whole Synod and to oversee all the property of the Synod, even that property that's managed by agencies and other corporate pieces of the Synod that do their little pieces of our life together. I should say little or sometimes big. And in those two seats, in the last triennium and somewhat before, we've observed some challenges and some opportunities. The challenges are when a district or a synod-wide corporate entity like the Lutheran Church Extension Fund or Concordia Plan Services goes to make a new corporation to perform some new function. For example, when LCEF needed a corporation to help with their operations in support of our congregations in Canada, or when Concordia Plan Services wanted to form a captive to help provide insurance to agencies and member congregations and schools of the Synod. They had to form new corporations for those things. And we found that the regulations that are in Synod's bylaws and in an old 1981 resolution that's still in effect and still governs the formation of new corporations for these purposes in the Synod really were not conducive to doing things in the way that needed to be done for business and legal reasons and to best accomplish the purposes that they had set out to do. So in order to address those challenges, the fact that our regulations for corporate pieces, corporate instruments for Synod and its agencies were, on the one hand, quite old. 1981 is a few years ago, and a lot has changed in corporate law, nonprofit law, and what the Synod is trying to do in those intervening decades. And the stuff that's in bylaw section 1.5, which is not everyone's favorite section of the handbook, but it is there. Those things were getting in the way of getting the actual work of the Synod done. And so the board of directors, together with the entities, got a group together to look at this whole problem, to kick the tires on it, get input from legal counsel, from the Commission on Constitutional Matters, and try to clean up this whole piece of policy and get it all into the handbook where everybody knows what the rules are, who's doing what, and what the expectations are for each piece of it, so that it's clear to the whole Synod what we're trying to do, and so that it will be possible in limited cases, carefully overseen, to do some new things that may have great value for our life together. That's really the whole essence of this longish resolution and kind of detailed bylaw proposal, kind of necessarily so that it's lengthy and detailed because it deals with complicated stuff. But the essence is really simple: to clean things up, to allow a few new carefully regulated opportunities, and to give us a clear framework for all these corporate pieces that we form to do different elements of our work together, so everybody knows what the expectations are, and we have the opportunity to get every animal in the proper place in the zoo and properly fed.
So, Mike, I know we have you on to talk about what the Pacific Southwest District is hoping to do in the future with this particular resolution. Do you have anything to say about what you've not been able to do under the current structure that could help people understand the type of things that Pacific Southwest is interested in doing, but that are currently not enabled by the current structure?
Yeah, thanks. That's a great question. And I really appreciated the opportunity to have been part of this conversation as the board of directors brought a group together for us to be able to discuss this stuff. What we find in our district is that when the unfortunate circumstance of a church closure occurs, and that property comes to us as district, and it doesn't always, but when it does, that property in our neighborhood is worth millions and millions of dollars. And it really raises the stewardship requirement of how well we can manage these resources that God has given us and given to his church for the advancement of the mission and bringing the hope of Christ to the world. We have not been able to do the work of redeveloping property for the sake of mission. And that's a real important piece for us. If we sold every piece of property that comes to us, and some of those, sometimes that is the correct decision to sell the property. In most cases, we're never going to go back into those communities again. It's too expensive to purchase property in our areas. So how do we put it to work? So the idea is we partner with Lutheran Church Extension Fund with a developer, we hope, that enables ministry to happen in that location and a new church to be started or ministry to be started in that location. And then it also produces sustainable income for that particular ministry. So we've got a couple projects in mind that we've been putting together, and we're on hold as we wait for Synod convention to figure out whether or not we can actually do this. So it's a big deal. We haven't been able to do it yet, but we're hoping and ready to do it when we can.
John, if you could also now talk us through the major sections of this resolution. There's a long beginning portion and then kind of essential changes in the bylaws themselves. What are we looking at here, and how should people be looking and kind of studying this so that when it comes time to vote, they know what they're looking at?
Sure. Yeah. And for those that are following along, maybe have a copy of Today's Business 1 at hand. This has been published. You can find Today's Business 1 on the Synod website, lcms.org/convention. You'll find there the publications that go along with the convention process. Today's Business Edition 1, this is Resolution 911. It starts on page 160 in that book. And so you can grab that and kind of follow along here, mark up some highlights maybe for later digestion if you like. There is a fairly lengthy rationale that goes through in more detail some of those challenges and opportunities that I mentioned, and certainly well worth reading. On page 161, it gives you something of a conceptual outline to what you're going to find in the bylaw proposal that follows. And a big part of that on page 161 is this taxonomy, let's call it, kind of using animals in the zoo language. I'm kind of corporate Linnaeus here, I guess, but a taxonomy of types of corporate instruments, that is legal entities that the Synod or its agencies might use to accomplish different purposes. And right now, the bylaws really only acknowledge one type of corporate instrument, which is an agency of the Synod. And an agency of the Synod is something that Synod or its agencies have made to fulfill the Synod's objectives. And many of them are separately incorporated from LCMS Inc. So examples would be your districts. Each of the 35 districts is separately incorporated to do the work of the Synod in that place. They're clearly pursuing Synod's objectives and what they do, but they have their own corporate identity. They own their own property. They handle their own legal affairs, all subject to oversight by the Board of Directors, of course, as the legal representative custodian of property for the whole Synod. But there are good legal reasons why they need to be a separate legal entity. Your Synod-wide corporate entities. These things are also agencies. But under these, there are other smaller things that we don't think about too much. They're not listed in the bylaws, but we've needed to form them for various legal and property reasons, not only the U.S., but around the world. We have foreign agencies overseas, where we have corporations in foreign countries that are there to provide for visa status for our missionaries that may be in country, to hold property that we're using for mission purposes, maybe coordinating with local church bodies by owning things for their benefit. So there's a whole web of Synod agencies that have been created underneath these regulations. So that's the first category, which will remain.
If I can jump in real quick, John, I also want to note when you say objectives here, you have in mind something specific. You're not just saying general objectives. You're actually defining this according to the Constitution, Article 3, objectives of the Synod. And this is, I think, going to be key for later definitions, right?
Absolutely, yeah. If you have a handbook of the Synod handy, I send out, I think, 35,000 of them every triennium. So there should be one. There we go. Yeah, we've got people showing them here. Constitution, Article 3. Reading the Constitution is a great way to learn about your Synod if you haven't already. But Article 3 lists the objectives for which the Synod is formed, and the agencies of the Synod are all pursuing those things, pursuing the unity of doctrine or practice in the Synod, providing care and protection for our congregations, members. There are 10 of them there to read, and the agencies are all very specifically directed at those things. So the proposal within that agency category, it creates two subcategories. One is the category of governed agencies, which is basically what we're familiar with. All the agency rules will continue to apply to them. The proposal, however, carves out a category of managed agencies, which differ from the others only in a couple of ways. One is the managed agencies are only for these smaller things not mentioned in the bylaws, like our foreign mission corporations or pieces that Synod, for whatever reason, has created to hold property or perform some specific function. The other difference is because they're only those smaller pieces that are subordinate to some properly governed other agency of the Synod or corporate Synod that has a board of directors that has all the rules that it follows about keeping it on track with the Synod. Those smaller agencies, the managed agencies, the proposal would allow some latitude in how their boards of directors are put together. Presently, boards of agencies can have on them only people that are not employed by any other agency of the Synod. So if you're an employee of corporate synod, you can't sit on the board of, say, a university of the synod. And there's some exceptions to that the bylaws allow or specify. We don't need to talk about that today. But what the managed agency category would allow us to do is if we had, say, a company that exists simply to hold property in a country in Asia for the support of our mission efforts, corporate synod could place employees of the Office of International Mission on that board and direct them how to use that company to support mission. We don't have to go recruit independent people to serve that because it simply exists to follow directives from the OIM here in St. Louis. So the board of directors would be able to create or designate as managed agencies things that we have, which will allow us more reasonable flexibility in filling those boards as employees come on and off and getting the work of the synod done more efficiently and with lower overhead. The bigger piece here is later on that page where we talk about non-agency instrumental entities. This is a new thing. I should say it's partially new. We recognize two categories of things that are not agencies, which we want the synod to be able to participate in, or I should say, we want there to be a concrete, well-defined mechanism within which the synod and its agencies can participate in these things. I'm going to treat the second of them first, which are passive investment entities. We had a question arise about whether synod or its agencies could be part of these things. Now, it's probably not a common thing in personal investing, but when you get to the scale of the LCMS Foundation or Concordia plans, where you've got a lot of money to invest, there are opportunities for investment in private markets that are not simply, buying a share of IBM, but where you actually have to put together a corporate instrument, put together a little limited liability company or something like that to manage a piece of investment where the synod entity might be the only investor or might join with a limited number of other investors, not as many stockholders as IBM would have, but a limited number to pool assets, to have an asset manager, investment manager come on and manage that investment, give the return back to whatever the agency or entity of the synod is. We call these passive investment entities because they're not doing any mission. They're not engaging in any business at the direction of the investors. They're simply a corporate instrument that's along that continuum from, putting your money in the mattress to putting it in the bank to owning a stock to having more money to invest and making a more complicated thing to deal with it. We wanted to make it very clear that it's possible for agencies of the synod to participate in these things so that the foundation, so the Concordia plans and others could have access to this sort of investment. We wanted it to be regulated by the board of directors. So that's all that passive investment entity category does. It's more a carve out than a creation of a new thing. They already exist. We're just making clear that it is a standard regulated thing that the bylaws understand as possible.
Okay. Actually, I think you answered the question I had, so just keep rolling, Dr. Sias.
Then I'll talk about the little bigger ticket item here, which is the special purpose entities. And these come into play when we talk about those opportunities that President Gibson mentioned, and that I mentioned the board of directors looking at this triennium. Agencies, for good reasons, have some very particular limitations on them. One of them is that if the agency is going to have members, corporate members, all those members that are kind of the owner of that agency have to be either corporate synod, LCMS, or other agencies of the synod. In fact, our regulations now say you can only have one member, and that it has to be either synod or an agency of the synod. That ordinarily is a very good thing, because if you have, for example, a foundation of a university, you don't want others running off with that money that's going to be needed for the university and its operations. You don't want to be contending with members that don't share our objectives or goals. And so that's very important. It is also limiting. If you're looking at a project like President Gibson is talking about, where you've got a piece of property, you want to redevelop that so that you can save a portion of it for ministry purposes, but you need resources more than the district or the agency the Synod has to really develop that footprint in a way that makes commercial sense so that you can preserve that chunk for ministry. You're going to need other investors, other participants in that project that will come alongside the district, properly structure an entity so that the district's interests are properly preserved, and then help you develop that property in such a way that there's a community built there that you can be a part of and that your ministry purpose can go forward. We can't make those at present because agencies can only have as participants things that are part of the Synod. We had a couple projects this triennium where educational institutions of the Synod were looking at opportunities like this, but we're just unable to pursue them beyond the idea stage because we couldn't form a corporate vehicle to do what they were looking to do. So that's the purpose of the special purpose entity category, to give Synod agencies and corporate Synod itself the ability to participate in these sort of corporate ventures, which would have a ministry benefit, but would not be themselves directly pursuing the objectives of the Synod in Constitution Article 3. So you're maybe building an apartment building or development that's got some shops and apartments in it, but within that, you've got a place for church worker housing, you've got a place for a worship center, you've got a place for a community service that's connected to Word and Sacrament ministry there. We don't own that whole thing anymore. It's no longer property of the Synod as a whole. We have rights that are reserved through the corporate entities and contracts we've put together. It's got other participants other than just Synod and its agencies that are putting money and effort into the thing to make the commercial enterprise go. But it is something that our agencies and entities are seeing a need to get into, to do ministry in their areas, to support ministry in their areas, and something the Board of Directors has taken on here alongside them and said, yeah, we think this is something we can do and properly regulate to help the life of our Synod together. So that's that special purpose entity category. We can talk a little more detail if you like about what is conceived of there and how that works, but that's the general idea.
Thank you, John. That's a great summary. I'm going to actually hand it over to Andrew, and it looks like he has something he wanted to say about this too.
Sure. Thank you, Roy. I wanted to pick up on one thing that President Gibson said and that Secretary Sias mentioned briefly, and that's really the process that we went through to get to this resolution. It's important for the listeners to know that this was something that we took great care in doing, and what the board did was we assembled a committee under the board called the Lead Committee. John knows the acronym.
Lutheran Entity Activity Development, yeah.
Yes. And what we did there is we pulled stakeholders from each of the different areas of Synod, from CUS to the universities, President Gibson in the Pacific Southwest District, and we had members from the international missions and national missions. So we went out there and we looked at what was taking place out in Synod, what was taking place in ministry, what challenges were each agency and ministry facing, what existed, and what opportunities were being missed. And we looked at, from a board's perspective, how could we best serve and meet the needs of our agencies in the ministry of Synod? And that's what you have before you. And so what this resolution and these proposed changes really are putting to paper what we do and what we have been doing. And it also allows for some additional opportunities.
Thank you, Andrew, for that summary. Let me, if I can, real quick, John and Andrew, I want to quickly summarize what you said for the user or the listener to make sure we're understanding on the same page. So what it looks like we have here is we're according to what Andrew's offering us, kind of regularizing in some sense what's already happening, and then opening up new opportunities. And we're doing this by virtue of defining what might be a governed agency versus a managed agency, and then opening up this thing called special purpose or instrumental entities, of which we have special purpose entities and passive investment entities. Am I understanding that kind of correctly in terms of broad brushstrokes, right?
That's it. It's really important, and this was the purpose of that 1981 resolution 507 that I've mentioned before, maybe not by number. The Synod became concerned in the early 80s that we were making corporations to do pieces of the work of the Synod, and we didn't have regulations for how those fit into the corporate framework, how they would be responsible to the Synod and convention ultimately. Mm-hmm. And so the Synod started adopting those regulations. And if you're going to make a corporation, it's a separate legal identity. That thing owns property. We need to make very certain that the thing is responsible to the Synod that has created it. And so this is really a cleanup of the language that brings that principle fully into the bylaws, and says if you're going to be making corporations, they have to be one of the types that we can fit in our zoo. It has to fit within this framework, and where it fits in the framework is going to tell you what regulations apply to that particular piece. Also, that we have the flexibility to do the work that the Synod needs to do in a modern era, but also that we're doing it within a framework that we can regulate and understand. We don't have property of the Synod walking off to do other purposes or falling out of the control of the Synod and convention that it's ultimately to be responsible to and to be serving those objectives with.
So we've kind of worked through and defined a bunch of things. One of the other questions I have in terms of definition is a term that shows up in the resolution called a ministry foothold. I believe this is specifically in reference to the special purpose entity, that this would have a ministry foothold in some way. So I'm going to start with Andrew, and I will be asking a similar question to you also, Mike. If you could help us understand, how is the Board of Directors defining this term ministry foothold? And the reason I'm asking is, the fact of the matter is it seems like this could be a pretty flexible term and could be kind of expanded or contracted, all sorts of issues related to it if we don't have some sense of what does ministry foothold mean when we're talking about these special purpose entities. So Andrew, what is the Board of Directors thinking here?
So with respect to ministry foothold, if you look at the details of the special purpose entity regulations, it notes that it limits the use of special purpose entities at this time to real estate development involving the services of LCEF. LCEF is doing real estate development work. They've got a resolution that's been proposed as well to add that to one of the purposes that they serve. But the board's concern was that we didn't get off into just developing property for the sake of doing commercial work. Mm-hmm. The development had to be for the purposes of supporting the ministry within the district, or within, for example, if it's a university, somehow it has to support those Article 3 purposes. And so anything that is proposed, there's a detailed process that an entity will have to go through in order to apply to use a special purpose entity, and it has to define the ministry purpose for which that entity is being used. And I think President Gibson can speak a little bit more to ministry foothold, but we're not holding to a fast and hard definition of it, because the districts have to have some flexibility in defining what ministry looks like in the Pacific Southwest, for example, versus something that takes place over here in the Mid-South District where I am. It might look different, so you can't really have one full, fast, and hard definition, but it's all tied to the Article 3 purposes for which that ministry exists.
So, Mike, I'm assuming you over there in the Pacific Southwest District have thought about this idea of ministry foothold and what this means. How are you guys kind of working to fit within that framework?
For us, it's the place where word and sacrament ministry is occurring around which the people of God gather. It's where a congregation is. And in that setting, it may have been a church that was planted 100 years ago, which is kind of old in our neck of the woods, and or just 15 years ago. But for whatever reason, it may have closed or it may still be existing. But it's the place where Lutheran Church Missouri Synod mission ministry is happening in a specific community. And our concern is if those do close and we aren't able to redevelop the ones that need to be redeveloped, then we lose that footprint in our community. And then the message and the hope of the gospel that we bring as Missouri Synod Lutheran Christians is going to be minimized in that community. So they're critical for us. We don't want to lose them. Where we have the ability to redevelop them for that same purpose.
John, I think we're getting close to kind of wrapping up our definition section. Is there anything else you wanted to add about terms that you think need to be defined here for folks voting on this resolution?
Well, I think the property of the synod thing is kind of interesting to talk about. There's some kind of fiddly definitions here, but some things that we've built in for clarity for the synod and for its agencies as we approach this. And one thing that may strike folks as a little bit odd is that anything that is held by synod, corporate synod, or an agency of the synod is property of the synod. That's not odd. That's just what it is. Everything we own, whether LCMS is on the title or a university or a seminary or whoever, is there for synod's purposes. It's responsible to the convention. We've said in here, though, that when we enter into the realm of the SPEs, the special purpose entities, or the passive investment entities, the property that those things hold, we're very explicit that it is not, unless otherwise stated in the documents, that stuff is not the property of the synod. And the reason I highlight that is it is important to understand when we enter into one of these arrangements, let's say we take the land that a church has been on, we redevelop it with the developer to put up a high-rise building that's got apartments, it's got shops, it's got whatever, it's got a place for that church to go on and to do its community work, to have its worship, housing for church workers, what have you. We may have an interest in that building. We may have rights to that piece of it that we're going to use. But in terms of the land that sits on and the building that's built there, it's no longer really free to the synod to repurpose for whatever it wants to do with it. It's not like the International Center where we own it. We could move out and do something different with it if we wanted. Now we're involved with other people. We're in legal structures that are complex. You've got to find a place for all those people to live and buy the building out, if you want to take it and repurpose it for something. There is a level of commitment to one of these projects at the upfront, going into its stage, that property is no longer so easily repurposable. We kind of give up our right to completely redo whatever we want with it in order, as Mike says, to preserve that footprint in a place that we can't otherwise afford to be. Or to have a place in some development that's bringing people together to be a part of the ministry that we're going to offer to them. So in case that strikes readers as odd, that's the reason for that exclusion. We want to be very upfront about that once you put a property or assets into something like this, it's really committed to that thing. You want to be careful to form it properly, and that's why the board of directors wants to be there and to dot all the I's, cross all the T's, and make sure that we're getting into a structure that makes good business sense and is going to actually support those ministries that we have in there. Maybe one other thing, if I can, too, and that is there's another exclusion here that may strike us as odd, and that is we say these SPEs and PIEs, too, they're not there to be actually themselves performing the Article 3 objectives. They can support them, but they're not themselves doing them. And, a viewer might say, well, why wouldn't we want them to if they could? The reason is when we're out there doing those Article 3 objectives ourselves, not just owning a place where ministry is going to take place that's going to be regulated some other way by being a congregation that's a member of the synod, or by being an agency of the synod or of a district that's doing work there. We want that. We want the work that's being done to be done under the regulations that are there for agencies of the synod. We want them to be completely guided by the constitutional confessional position of the synod and the objectives of the synod. We want them to be fully regulated by the synod and convention, and to be governed by folks that share in entirety our confession and our outlook. The developers that are in these things, they may not all be by the book Missouri Synod Lutherans. We hope they might be, many of them, but it's not necessarily the case that that's going to work everywhere. But we don't want one of those entities formed with people of different objectives, people of different views about what the faith is, to be going out there and saying, I'm a college of the synod, I'm a university of the synod, I'm a seminary of the synod, because they're not. We have agencies for those purposes that are properly regulated to do all those things that are the very lifeblood of the church. These things are for holding property where that stuff takes place. And we can have a lower level of regulation as to who governs that, who has input into it, what happens with it, because we're taking care of that ministry the same way we always have through our carefully structured agency regulations. So a couple of exclusions that may seem kind of odd details as you read over them, but I think make sense when you consider them in context of what we're trying to do and what we're trying to avoid. Any confusion about people in the synod doing stuff, kind of putting a thing in under one title but meaning to do something else with it, that's all written out here quite carefully.
Let's move to talking about what this means for our life together. And here, Andrew, I want to start with you in a question that gets at the first part of my opening here, that some have criticized the resolution as an overreach of power by the Board of Directors. I believe one of the criticisms was related to the sub-agencies, kind of the managed agencies in particular, I think. One of the criticisms has been that this makes them less independent of the LCMS Board of Directors. First off, the question is that accurate or not? But then really kind of more broadly, how should people understand this? Is this a concentration of power on the Board of Directors? Is this BOD overreach? Are there any checks and balances on the Board of Directors? That kind of constellation of questions. Could you talk to that, please?
Sure. So let's talk about the general question of overreach and power. First, I wouldn't say that this is an exercise of power. The church doesn't wield power. The church, and especially the Board of Directors, has servants that steward the assets, manage the property, and the business and legal affairs of the synod. So what you see here is an attempt to define in clearer terms the responsibility that's already given to the Board of Directors. It's not a raw power grab. The board is already defined in the Constitution and bylaws as the body that has the ultimate legal responsibility for the organization's affairs. And if you look at what this Board of Directors does, we're different than any other Board of Directors or Board of Regents within an agency of synod. So if you look at if I were a member of a Board of Regents, I focus on the work of the school. If I'm a member of the Board of Directors of a district, I focus on the work of the district. As a member of the Board of Directors, we're not just the Board of Directors for LCMS Inc. We're also the Board of Directors for Synod, and the bylaws give us oversight responsibility for all of the agencies. And if you let that sink in for a minute, that means that we have to know a little bit about what CPH does, foundation, LCEF, the districts, the seminaries, the regions. And so when we have old bylaws that have provisions that are in resolutions from 1981, we've got activities that are going on in Synod that aren't clearly defined. It makes sense to define, what is the actual scope of the work that the board of directors is given to do, and that's what this proposal does. Now, there's also a couple of things in here that to the accountability point. There's something in here, the registry of entities, which is something that will be created in going forward. Each of the entities will have to report to the board of directors, make reports to the board of directors, and they will then be kept in a registry. So now that registry will be public, and it will be available to each member and each member congregation, so everyone can see what's out there. Everyone can see what the board of directors sees, what the board of directors is approving, what the board of directors is doing, and we also have some additional checks. We also have the CCM process as well. So it's not just the board of directors exercising this oversight and approving things that are going on. There's real checks and balances built into the proposal.
Mike, once again, I think here is where we can shift the conversation again. I think there's a lot of interest, really particularly around the special purpose entities, and kind of getting to the second half of what I introduced with is where we're going to eventually end up in this conversation or this question with you, but about, is this the church just operating as a business? So what I want to get to you is, what are some specific examples? Do you have a specific example? Okay, here's the thing that we wanted to do. This resolution, if passed, will enable us to do this. What is that example, kind of in view of where we're going with this question?
As we looked at what we're going to do with properties, we realized when we were starting to talk about the magnitude of what these gifts are, that we were over our, underwater. It was way over our heads and our ability to do that. And so the partnership that we as district can have with Lutheran Church Extension Fund, and particularly what they do with their division of real estate solutions, has been so important for us, where congregations are not in this whole mix of SPEs because they can develop their properties as agencies of Synod district can. So how do we think it through in a different way? We're very blessed in our partnership with Lutheran Church Extension Fund that we have the first full-time commercial property developer in Synod on our staff, who helps us evaluate properties, and in doing so, think through options of what might happen. Some cases we hold the properties because we're looking at what cities are doing in redevelopment. Maybe this is a property we can just repurpose, or this is a piece of property where we can replant it as it is with some remodel to assist. Or is it a place where the termites have been holding hands for so long, there's nothing else that can be done except for the building to just be torn down? And then the third option is, in those certain cases, this is a place we need to be. So the personal or the individual example is Gethsemane Lutheran Church in Riverside, California. This is what we call the Inland Empire. It's east of Los Angeles. And in Riverside, we had a congregation, Gethsemane, 3.5-acre property, and that congregation closed after many, many years, about 75 years. And when that did, the property reverted to the district for our use or expansion of mission and ministry, so that it stayed in the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod in that footprint. Now, we could have sold it, but we realized that directly across the street is the University of California, Riverside. And we don't have a campus ministry on that university. And so the question was, what could we do here? being able to repurpose a building that was ready to fall down, that's that termite thing, was just not going to work. And so we began to think it through. And then working with Lutheran Church Extension Fund Real Estate Solutions, Bart Day and his team, Tom Campbell, who's the director of that category, and our own Josh Ree, we were able to look at partners for potential development. Builders, and this is important for what John was saying, that share our values, are Christ followers and proclaimers. Not all of them Lutheran, but a couple of them attended our Lutheran high schools, and one was even connected to Concordia University, Irvine. And so we had a shared view of it. Then we began to think through, and they began to do their work. We discovered that on that 3.5 acres that has a education building that belonged to the church, that it was still in good shape, and it was going to be repurposed to become the community center. And on that, in that community center is going to be a gathering space with a little platform and even a sound booth in back and a place even for an office. For us, that's a place where we believe Word and Sacrament ministry can happen. So what was the plan? 72 units, townhouse units, not high-rise apartments, but townhouse units. They're 2 and 3 bedroom with garage underneath. And in our world, we see a lot of them with like patios up on the roof. But these units would be built creating a community. But because we are contributing the property, we get one of those as a parsonage. Now, in our neck of the woods here in Irvine, where I live, the average home price is $1.7 million for a 1,500 square foot house. So getting a parsonage is a big deal for us. Now, this particular builder that we work with is not a builder who builds and then sells. They build and hold. And what that means is our interest in that property continues. So what do we have? A community directly across the street from a university with a parsonage where we can put a church planter and a campus ministry kind of guy and his family, we hope. And then to have a place for gathering, for community, for faith, for worship. And with that, because we retain the property in the sense of our involvement and our contribution, it will spin off $200,000 a year in income that will fund that location's ministry. Wow, what an incredible opportunity. And it's not just in our district, it's going to be in all the districts as they try to rethink strategically what they can do in that particular area. So that's a kind of shovel-ready piece that we've hit pause on because we know that all of this has to come together. But in doing so, it would give us an opportunity to engage in a very significant ministry in a place where we know we need to be and we retain the footprint that God gave to his church so many years ago.
Let me ask a follow-up question there, Mike, if I can, about, so you mentioned this builder is a builder that builds and holds as opposed to build and sells. What happens in this particular circumstance? Obviously, each of these are going to be slightly different, but what if the worst case happens and the builder does, for some reason, have to sell this? What happens then to the investment of the district?
Sure. Well, then we get the amount of money that our contribution is worth in the combined effort of what that sale would be. And so that would bring us millions of dollars that we could then invest in income producing investments, which would then fund that ministry still. So it works either way for us, but we like it especially because of kind of the live interaction and ministry activity that's going to be there. And really allow us to be a participant going forward. Yeah, they have other properties that they do build and sell, but it is their plan to move into this season with that other build and hold, and then receive the income off of it long term.
So then I guess the final extension of this question I was kind of leading to was, then how are you ensuring that this doesn't simply become the Pacific Southwest District dabbling in business, right? What are the assurances that this is not happening, or is it kind of?
Yeah, and that's absolutely the critical question here. We're not going to do any of these if it is not about the ministry of word and sacrament being in a location. And this is one of the blessings that we have of being part of Lutheran Church with Lutheran Church Extension Fund. We're with trusted partners. And then the other piece is the accountability to the board of directors. And as we put an SPE together for these projects, it's got to go to the board of directors for their review. And if they think that we're just going into business to make money off of a piece of property that God gave to his church for the sake of the gospel, you can hear where I'm leading, they should say no to us. Okay? Because that's not our purpose. We're not in the building business. And see, that's the challenge for us is we're not in the real estate business either. And that's why having a partner like Lutheran Church Extension Fund and what they've created with Real Estate Solutions takes that pressure off of my team and allows us to do the work that we're doing in resourcing congregations and schools. So, built in accountability and all the reporting that has to happen, that's all going to be part of that. That is not a hurdle for us. That is a blessing because there's others who are smarter and aware of other issues that sometimes we're blind to when we're trying to think of what can we do here in this particular location. And in doing so, it keeps us all on track and doing the work that we've agreed to do together.
Andrew, did you have some thoughts on that?
Yes, President Gibson talks about accountability to the board of directors, but one thing folks should see in the way that these guidelines are written is it doesn't just provide accountability; it provides clear direction to the agencies of what's expected. Where the bylaws presently are unclear. They don't have these definitions. That's number one. And then number two, they promote, they take away the points of friction where the board is out there saying, hey, where are your documents? We need to see them. We want to make sure they're in compliance. It creates a mechanism where this is automatic, but it forces us to talk to each other and work together. And we demonstrated by this process that we went through of over 18 months that we do really well when we talk together, that we can come up with common solutions. And that's kind of the vision going forward, that we will continue to be collaborative with the agencies, with the districts, throughout the entire process. We want to make this process work for everyone because we are the board, we serve the church.
John, I feel like you probably have some comments about the oversight portion of this.
Yeah, I just want to start by saying I really appreciate something Mike said and the way he put it, that oversight makes us all stronger. And, being able to have a structure that gathers the sharp minds and the proper authorities around a project like this to say, yeah, this is good for the church, we're going to move forward, is so essential to something like this when we're looking at getting into it. Um, it's to me, power only begins where proper authority has ended. And this thing adds a few pages to the handbook, which is okay. I'll still send them out. But if you want to see in particular, page 171, the piece we're talking about here, about a line 23, this limitation that sets the expectation, not just for the agencies, the districts want to get into these, but the expectation for the board of directors to say, this is what the bylaws expect of you if you're going to approve one of these, that you can do this real estate development, redevelopment, or holding, provided that the project both includes features that physically accommodate ministry purposes, that's what Mike's been talking about, and involves, at least as a consultant, the Lutheran Church Extension Fund, which has that expertise again, Mike mentioned, so we're sure we get into these the right way. So a lot of effort, that 18-month process Andrew mentioned, a ton of effort has gone through with many, many capable hands and many revisions. As the one who maintained the draft, I'll say many revisions over those 18 months really have, I think, made a strong document I'm really happy to be a part of.
Andrew, since we're talking about this and the oversight in particular, Does the Board of Directors have a sense of how they are going to be doing this process, this oversight process, that prevents the process from simply turning into mere paperwork? Like, what's the process actually look like? How is the board going to be doing this oversight of these entities?
That's a great question. There are a couple of things. First, the board isn't going to be in there doing the day-to-day work of it. We rely on staff and their expertise to gather the reporting, to look at the paperwork, and to then provide the recommendations to the board. And the staff will, point out any issues with it, and then we can address that with those agencies within the context of the board meeting. That's number one. Number two, this public registry piece is very important because as we go forward, we're going to have to develop the application process for creating these entities. We're going to have to develop the reporting process, and those are usually done with policies by the board. The board will continue, or at least the vision is that the board will continue to work with the same group or even an expansive group to develop those those processes, and policies, so that we get something that is very streamlined, that can go into that public registry, and then we can have access to it and be able to look at the documents and, pretty easily. The other thing to keep in mind too is there's another overture that the board has, and that's to create a chief operating officer position. And under that position is where risk and compliance would go. And so there's your personnel that would be handling the registry and reporting aspect of this for the board. So, these are things that the board is already doing. We already rely on staff for it. So it's not as if there's going to be a ton of extra work for the board to do. Might be some more pages and more words to read, but that's part of the world that we live in.
So is that where, real quick, is that where at the bottom of the resolution, the CFO listed an anticipated cost, estimated cost, annual cost? Is that where this comes in, is in terms of staffing that risk and compliance portion under the COO?
Secretary Sias, I think, can speak to that a little bit better, but yes, that's my understanding. Is that where it is? So think of it this way: we've got some things internally that are already in place that make the creation of the registry really almost cost neutral. Okay. It's the staffing where you would find some issues, and if that's approved, this will be built out, and we've got that in place. The other thing is, there's going to be some initial work in categorizing all the agencies that are out there. But once we get that process done, we should have a very streamlined, modern corporate registry and property registry. And we'll know, as a board of directors, we'll be able to look out there and see what we own in Southeast Asia, what the corporate records for entities out there are, and down to South America and into the Western United States. And that's really the vision, to bring the good ship Missouri, turn it around and refit it to be a 21st century ship.
Mike, you had some thoughts on this oversight piece also.
Yeah, one of the things I've heard from others is the concern, how in the world is the board of directors going to be able to do this work? And they're just going to be just inundated by all of these things. I don't think that's necessarily going to be the case. I mean, there's going to be some startup stuff, as Andrew was talking about, but in our case, we have that Gethsemane project in Riverside ready to go. We have another one that we would like to do, but it's with the same builder, and it'd be the same kind of a partnership. so that we're not having to recreate the wheel every single time we sit down to this. So I don't think there's going to be as many of these as people think there are. Yes, there's going to be a ramp up because some of us are sitting around waiting to go. But I don't think it's going to be this massive piece that is going to overwhelm what is going to be needed to be accomplished.
I'm going to shift real quick to another, a little more minor criticism, but I just want to make sure we get this in here and address this. And I'm going to ask you this question, John. It's kind of a two-parter. One of the concerns I've also heard is that I believe this is especially in relation to the special purpose entities. The board of directors can waive certain bylaws in the creation of these entities. And the concern was, we have bylaws for a reason. Why are we giving the board the ability to waive bylaws? So I guess that's really kind of the first question. What portions of the bylaws can be waived? And are there really any safeguards in place surrounding this?
Sure. So that actually is in relation not to the special purpose entities, but to the agencies other than those agencies that are named in the bylaws. So the proposal doesn't give the board of directors the ability to waive the requirements, say, for a Concordia publishing house or for Concordia Plan Services. Those things that are in the bylaws are there. The board of directors is subject to them, and they are what they are. So, if you want to take and do something different with those, this doesn't give you a chance to do that. You're going to have to take that to another convention and convince them. But what the proposal does grant on page 164, proposed bylaw 1522, provides that the board of directors can waive for other agencies that are corporate agencies some of the other requirements. It's not an entirely new thing. If you look at your present 2023 handbook at bylaw 1536, that bylaw was put in 2016 to require certain specific language to be in the articles of incorporation of every agency in the Synod. Really important stuff, what's in your articles of incorporation, because that's what's registered with the state. That's what you're legally held to as the purpose and the rules under which you're incorporating. And that required two things. One, a relationship language that said that the agency would be subject to the Constitution, bylaws, and resolutions of the Synod. Hugely important for agencies to remain responsible to the convention and the rules we've set out for our life together. The other piece is, if you ever dissolve the agency, language there to provide that the assets that are there, subject to the liabilities, go back to the agency or to the Synod that formed the thing. The board of directors today is able to waive or modify those fundamental bylaw requirements about language that's there in your articles of incorporation. Some might argue the most important language that's there to keep our agencies responsible to the Synod, but they were allowed to waive it because there are certain circumstances in which you just can't make a company to do what you want to do and put that language in there the way the bylaws require. And a good example of that is if you're starting a company overseas, where we simply don't have the same First Amendment protections, the same legal system that we have here. Other countries have their own concept of not-for-profit entities that doesn't contemplate their being beholden to a not-for-profit in some other country and returning all their assets across the border when the thing winds up. And so to help LCF do business in Canada, the board of directors had to deal with that. So all this proposal does in 1522 is expand the board's ability to grant some of those waivers to certain specific pieces of the requirements of bylaw section 1.5 for those little agencies, the ones that are below the level that's in the bylaws. And it actually, as I said before, power only begins where authority ends. If you read bylaw 1522 as proposed, it sets forth very rigorous criteria and a procedure that'll be able to be monitored by the congregations of the Synod whenever the board of directors goes to grant one of those waivers. You basically have to demonstrate, the agency that's coming and asking for a waiver, that it's impossible to fulfill the Synod's objectives through that entity that's being created without doing the waiver, and that there are, in the opinion of legal counsel, appropriate mechanisms in place to take care of whatever the concern was that those things were meant to address. So it actually, it expands, yes, the scope of waivers that the board of directors is able to give, but it also constrains the board's ability and guides the board's thinking as it manages those mechanisms to properly serve the needs of the synod in a whole host of jurisdictions where we can't always apply these things. And under present bylaws, if you can't apply them, you can't make the entity and can't do the thing that you were intending to do. So it's been limiting. It's something the Commission on Constitutional Matters has a lot of experience, often frustrating to the agencies that apply because the board of directors can't help them when the CCM says what you're doing is contrary to the bylaw. No one can waive it. You got to wait for the convention. So this will be, I think, a helpful and responsible tool to help us get the work of the synod done with laws that are different in every place, situations that are always changing.
Andrew, do you have any thoughts on the board's perspective about both kind of the opening of this ability to make these waivers, but then also the restrictions placed on it?
Sure. It's not a question that has actually come before the board too often, and I think in the last triennium, it's only come before the board one time, and that's in the case of the LCEF, and and I think that's because the questions had gone to the CCM, and when the CCM says there's no power to do this, that puts an end to it. But if you look at the actual constraints on the board here, when the question does come before the board now, we don't have any guidance other than potentially a CCM opinion. In this case, now there's a mechanism. Obtain legal counsel, decide if it's appropriate, and then it still has to go before the CCM for final approval. So, think of it this way. I mean, the convention through its bylaws is deciding when, how, and under what safeguards a waiver may be granted. The board doesn't have an opportunity to simply ignore the rules and do what it wants. It's subject to these restrictions, and it's subject to board minutes, public visibility, and our duties of care, loyalty, and obedience. So, the other thing to keep in mind, too, if we get recurring waivers, that indicates that there's a bylaw issue, and that question needs to be addressed in the bylaws. So I think this provides the proper guidance, and it strikes the right balance for the board, and it constrains our ability just to grant them because we want to.
Andrew, my second to last question here, I'm going to ask you, but you can certainly punt it to John. I'm not entirely sure who's the best person to ask this question of. But it's really more a question of kind of overarching with this whole discussion of agencies and entities. What sort of legal protections, liability protections are being built in to protect the synod in the formation of these entities, such that some of the liabilities don't, if something goes wrong, these don't roll up to the synod more broadly? I'll ask you that question, Andrew, but if you want to kick it over to John, that's totally fine too.
Well, I will ask Secretary Sias to chime in, look, that ultimately, I'm a lawyer by trade, and so I work on the defense side of things, and it doesn't matter how you write your bylaws, your constitution, your contracts, your agreements. Somebody on the other side will always file suit. And so, that we just live in a very litigious society, and it's something that we can't avoid. And you can do everything in your power to write a perfect bylaw and a perfect contract. There's some innovative lawyer somewhere that'll try and find a loophole and try and exploit it. So, when we went through this process, we went through the process with legal counsel involved, Synod legal counsel. And if you haven't met our Synod legal counsel, Lucy Huber, she is absolutely fantastic, and she does a tremendous job. But not only was she involved, each of Foundation, CPS, LCEF, and CPH, legal counsel from each of those entities was involved, and we invited all of the other agencies to have their legal counsel look at the bylaws that were changes that we're proposing and vet them. And so, this has gone through rigorous legal examination, and each of the entities that I just mentioned has signed off on the bylaws. If there's a concern here, there are a couple of legal protections that are put in. One, the waiver issue. You have to get a legal opinion before you form it, or before you grant the waiver. Two, on the SPE side, if you look at the requirements, they're very strict. The SPE formation has to have a legal opinion. It's got to have a risk management plan. And there has to be an indemnification built into the formation paperwork to indemnify Synod for any potential liability that may arise out of the use of an SPE. So there are specific legal protections. Does that mean we won't get sued in the future? No. But we've done our best, as we can on the front end. But you always review and see what happens in practice and make adjustments as necessary.
John, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, well said. And I'll say when you do get sued, which will happen, clarity at that point is your friend. And having bylaws that have been worked through consistently that provide a coherent framework and that provide an opportunity for proper corporate structures to be put in place to manage these things all help mitigate the risk that's involved in being out there and being part of the world and trying to do ministry in it. If you think of a project like Mike's talking about, where you've got let's say the Pacific Southwest District did have the cash to put up and build that whole development themselves and own that thing as the district, and have a bunch of people, owning townhomes, renting townhomes, whatever, have all that going on property that belong to the district as the district. I'd have some, probably pretty friendly but frank conversations with Mike about whether that's a smart idea, because that's a lot of potential slip and falls on district property. And, we got to figure for people that are there, not necessarily for ministry purposes, just going about their lives, it doesn't make sense to expose the district directly as an activity of the district to all that stuff that's going on. So having the ability to build a proper corporate structure that says, nope, this is not district property. This is property of this entity that holds this, and that entity provides a place for ministry, it provides a place for people to live, but that's the responsible entity for that property. And then maintaining that corporate structure and the proper distinction of authority between the district and those that are governing that thing, it helps when you do get sued for that to get sorted out properly under the law without liability rolling up to a place that doesn't belong. So, it seems like a risk of getting into stuff, but providing a well thought through way for people to get into things that they probably need to do is a good investment for the future, as opposed to trying to do stuff in structures we have that aren't ideal for the thing you're trying to accomplish.
My last question, I'm going to ask all three of you gentlemen. I'm going to start with Mike here. Of course, one of our key goals here is to provide the information to delegates at the upcoming convention so that they can vote knowledgeably on Resolution 911. Mike, is there any piece of information, one kind of key piece of information that people really need to know to make this decision in your opinion?
The cooperative effort that's gone on in the last 18 months, I think should say a lot to our church. Um, Lots of different people, lots of different voices, lots of different perspectives, all of them working towards this one outcome of enabling appropriately, effectively, the church to do mission and ministry in the 21st century. That is different from 1981. But that cooperative piece, I hope everybody pays attention to it. Uh, Probably a lot of people would think, yeah, kind of interesting that the board of directors and the Pacific Southwest District signed off on this together. That just shows we're in this together. We're synod across the entire country in what we get to do on this. And I think that's a critical item that I hope people will pay attention to.
Andrew, the same question to you. What is the one key piece of information that delegates need to have in mind and be aware of to vote knowledgeably here?
Well, I will say amen to President Gibson's piece of information, and I will add to that this. There is a general concern that as you look at the many words that comprise this proposed bylaw changes, that it gets too much into the things of the world. That it simply focuses on commercial and business. But that's not the case. The one important thing that our delegates should know and that our Synod should know is that these changes are designed to support the Article 3 ministry purposes of each one of our agencies. And these changes are intimately connected to and grounded in those purposes. We won't deviate from them and we won't waver from them. And as these things are brought before the board of directors, if you look at the wording of these bylaws, they have to say what the ministry purpose is. And we will continue to focus on the things of God, and that's exactly what this resolution seeks to do.
And John, finally, same question to you.
Yeah, well said both. I'll second all of that. My work's a little dry. I've been here about 10 years. Spent a lot of time in the governing documents of Synod's agencies and CCM with board of directors, working with agencies and entities trying to do these kind of projects and often kind of being frustrated at the end that we can't. Your board of directors and a bunch of friends, and I really mean that, friends in the corporate entities, the districts and others, are coming to the Synod with a lot of deferred maintenance and saying, we haven't touched some parts of this since 1981. We need to tune up the house on this so we can all do our work in it, make sure everything's properly assured, get code checked, and build a house we can live in together and invite new people into for generations to come. So this is all a help to that. And if the convention would enter in with me and with us, the board, with our friends, to get that done, that would give me such joy. The other piece of this is to hear about a project like Mike's talking about. I started out, kind of became a pastor because campus ministry, thought that's what I was going to do with my life. Instead, I'm doing something a little drier. Served first in a drier place, which was fantastic. Now I'm doing bylaws. But to see that work can provide us a mechanism to do the kind of thing Mike's talking about here in reality, to make that happen in a well-regulated way, in a way that's going to serve, is a really exciting thing for me. So if the convention, is persuaded to enter in with us into catching up on the deferred maintenance and building a foundation that'll let us do some really inspiring and hopeful things, I think if we can approach that with that mindset, the complexity this adds, the risk, the challenge that's there, looks to me pretty realistic to take.
Thank you, gentlemen, for your time. Much appreciated. For all of you who stuck with us all the way through this, much appreciated. Thank you for listening and watching this podcast, and we certainly hope that it's given you the information you need to better vote when it comes to convention, or to simply be aware of here's the work of your church and here's what your church is doing in all the many and various ways that it is proclaiming the gospel. We mentioned links to a couple of documents. We'll make sure those links make it in the show notes. So if you're on YouTube, check the show notes below. If you're listening on a podcast, check the description of your podcast for those description links Yes, John, what do you got?
I will just add, if anybody has watched to this point, you must be interested. If you've got further questions that aren't answered by reading this thing, feel free to contact us at LCMS Secretary at lcms.org. We're happy to hear from you. If you have comment for the floor committees that are going to be handling this, we're happy to pass that along through that same mechanism as well. But feel free to reach out if this is your groove. We'd love to hear from you.
All right. Again, thank you everybody for listening, and we certainly hope that all of our listeners to the Lutheran Witness podcast are better able to interpret the world from a Lutheran perspective.